Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for supporting this event. I can't quite see everybody with the spotlights right in my eyes, but anyway, we'll see how we get on. My name is Mark Butcher. I'm the president of Winchester Rotary, at least until the end of this month. Before we start, just a couple of things. So firstly, the in case of emergency kind of announcement. So there will always be staff member at the back of the auditorium, or planetarium I should call it. Emergency exits are at the front right and at the back of the auditorium. So obviously, should you need either of those, and the fire assembly point is in the highest level of the car park. So it's not the few parking spaces that are close to the planetarium. It's the ones that are furthest away, but the highest level, that's where the assembly point is. So please gather there if we have to. Secondly, I would like to thank Wonder Seekers Charity, so the folks who manage this site. For those of you who don't know, it's actually been our club charity this year, but for their support in actually putting this event on this evening. They've been very, very helpful. So without further ado, I'd like to present our speakers for this evening, covering a subject which should be of interest of all of us. I know there's some experts here, but I think a lot of the folks here, like myself, have very little knowledge about this particular subject. So firstly, we have Professor Kordo Saeed, who's a fellow member of Winchester Rotary. This next bit's a bit of a mouthful, so I might get my tongue twisted around this. He's a consultant clinical microbiologist at University Hospital Southampton, NHS Foundation Trust, and a professor at the University of Southampton. I think I've got that right. Cool. His interests are infections in intensive care. He's the chair of the Rapid Diagnostics and Biomarker Working Group of the International Society of Anti Microbial Chemotherapy. Phew. Done. Good. Enough on Kordo. Our second speaker, well known to many of you, is Dr. Danny Chambers, MP for Winchester constituency and a veterinary surgeon. He holds a Master of Science in Epidemiology and Infectious Disease Control. Danny has drawn on his experience to bring attention to Anti Microbial Resistance, or AMR, and serves as secretary of the all-party parliamentary group on AMR. So finally, before we start, I would like to remind you all that profits from this evening will go to End Polio Now, which is part of IBM's worldwide, sorry, not IBM, that's who I used to work for, Rotary's worldwide charity. So any donations you're happy to give this evening, I'm sure will be gratefully received. But we will hear a little more about that from another member of Winchester Rotary, Gillian Russell, towards the end. Jill can speak about this from very personal experience, as can Kordo, actually. So without that, I'm going to hand you over to our speakers. Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome everyone again. I would like just to set the scene about bacteria. This is why we are here, antimicrobial resistance, which could happen in many other organisms that cause infection in human, but bacteria tonight. If you look at the evolution of life, life existed for 4.5 billion years ago. Bacteria existed about 3.5 billion years ago. We, Homo sapiens, human, more or less 300 years old, 300,000 years old. Okay? There is a reason why I'm mentioning this. If you condense this evolution into 1 year, bacteria was born on the 1st of January, just literally after midnight. Homo sapiens, us, December 31st at 23:56 hours. They are far more experienced than us. Okay? So we have a lot to catch up. Antibiotics, they're a few seconds old. So that's why bacteria are cleverer than us, and can overcome antimicrobials to become resistant. So antimicrobial resistance is when the bacteria fights back. And that's through many mechanisms. Sometimes bacteria mutate, Sometimes bacteria change their shape. Sometimes bacteria produce enzyme to destroy antibiotics. They are so clever sometimes when the antibiotic gets inside the bacteria just pumps it out, just spits it out, and it becomes useless. And that's why it's really important for us as a community to look after antimicrobials. And I said to you, bacteria is really clever. They even have sex. So this is two different species of bacteria. Common, they live in our guts, and sometimes they cause infection. One of them called E. coli and the other one called Klebsiella. They can cause urinary infection, they can cause sepsis. And through this fine tube, which is called the sex pilus, they can exchange genetic material. And that genetic materials could make them more powerful, more aggressive, causing more infection, but also they can exchange resistance genome. So they make them more resistant to antibiotics. Hence, infection prevention is really important when we practice in medicine. Another way of bacteria to hide themselves from our immune cells and from antibiotics is something called biofilms. So they aggregate together and they cover themselves in a layer of complex sugar. And our immune cells, the white blood cells, wouldn't recognize the bacteria. And they stay calmly there until, for example, the immune cells are away or the antibiotic is away, and they come back and they cause infection. That's why it's really important to look after antibiotics. And AMR has got a huge impact, and I'm sure Danny will talk about this in more detail. And so AMR can cause increased length of stay. So more beds are occupied. Just think about the NHS. So already we are talking about shortages of beds. So if someone has got an infection, especially with an antimicrobial resistant organism, they would have longer hospital stay, can cause increased, sadly, mortality. And it's been estimated annually directly infection due to AMR-related organism can cause about 1.27 million globally. And that's an estimate directly. Indirectly, it could reach up to 5 million. So it's a huge impact on population. It also poses a threat to food security as well as peace. And it's costly. Imagine someone staying longer in hospital, they cost more. Someone ended up in intensive care unit, they cost more. Their care would cost more, so cost us more. This distribution is death due to antimicrobial resistance is variable from a place to a place. And you could see in this graph, if you look at the green bars, it's not very clear, unfortunately here, but most of the deaths happen in low and middle income countries, sub-Saharan Africa particularly, where the public health infrastructure is not there, where diagnostics are not available, where access to antimicrobial, access to good infection prevention, water, sanitation, hygiene is not up to standards. But microbes do not recognize borders. So whatever affects Africa could affect us at some point. And globally, there are lots of initiatives, including from UN, from WHO. There is something called Global Action Plan. And it has mainly 5 pillars. We need to be aware of what's going on around us, around antimicrobial resistance. For that, we need a good surveillance system. We need to reduce incidence of infection. We need a good infection prevention and public health infrastructure. We need to invest in diagnostic, invest in expertise, in education, and then optimizing use. How do we optimize use? Again, that's through education and more resources. And in the UK, we have National Action Plan, which similarly summarizing and acting on those global action plans. And then locally in hospitals, for example, and if down the road in rural Hampshire County Hospital, they would have some similar measures, but more granular, what to do in day-to-day clinical practice, for example, having guidelines, educations, good infection prevention policies, investment in diagnostics, audit, research, feedback, etc. And in the UK, we are generally at the forefront of diagnostics. And this is just as an example, We are one of the first countries in the world to implement metagenomics. I'm sure all of you have heard about PCR during COVID. PCR is like a photocopier of microbial DNA or RNA. And PCR, you have a target, you have COVID, you're looking for COVID, you're trying to amplify. Metagenomics is fishing with a net. You're trying to amplify wherever microbial genome is there blindly in a sample, and then amplify it and see what's causing someone illness or infection, and then give them targeted treatment. So again, in summary, my son is here. He's 14 now. I'm going to mention it. When he was 4, he coined the word conflicated. So he couldn't say complicated. So conflicated is something really complex, full of conflicts. So I think this is what AMR is. It's conflicated. And it's linked to education globally. It links to food security, water security. Vaccination is related. It basically encompasses a lot of things that we encounter here. And I'm going to hand over to Danny now.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's an absolutely pleasure to be here. For those who don't know, one of the many reasons I stood for Parliament was that I thought we desperately needed more people with science backgrounds in Parliament, because some of the biggest issues facing the world now are, climate change, risk of pandemics, anti microbial resistance, and I also remember one of the reasons I ended up becoming a vet was because I really loved science at school. And I remember going to the planetarium in Plymouth, which is the nearest big city to where I grew up in Devon, and being blown away by the planetarium. And so I really got into science, and probably because I grew up on a farm and working with animals and I liked science, that's kind of why I ended up going down the veterinary route. But I know many of you were here about 3 or 4 years ago when we launched our campaign for Parliament, but we launched it here in the Science Centre, talking about things like climate change and the need to have scientists in Parliament. And then when we won the election, we had our big celebration party here at Winchester Science Centre. So it's a place that means a huge amount to me, and I think I'm very fortunate as one of the few scientists in Parliament to have a venue like this in the constituency. Thank you for that introduction. That really was fantastic. I've done a lot of work around the world on sort of global health, One Health projects, which I'll talk about shortly. And I think the biggest risks we face over the next 20 years, whether these are pandemics, antimicrobial resistance, food system shocks, they're not going to arrive neatly labelled as a health problem or an environmental problem or a security problem. They emerge at the points where all these different systems collide. And the problem we have is that our institutions and our governments are set up to deal with all these issues separately. So one of the things that veterinary medicine teaches you very quickly is that the most dangerous problem is often not the one that is the one you see first. It's often the ones that are budding sort of quietly in the background. So, for example, in veterinary practice, you might see a sick animal. And, well, you regularly see sick animals, actually. It'd be surprising if you didn't. But very often, the question isn't just how do you treat that animal. The question, especially when you're doing farm animal veterinary medicine, which I've done a lot of, is that you're looking after the entire herd. And so the real question is often much bigger than the individual case. So it's very similar to public health in that respect. So treating pneumonia in young cattle and calves is something every farm animal vet will do on a very regular basis. And they often need treatment very quickly. The calves can go downhill within hours and they can die. And even those that eventually recover will have permanent lung damage and they'll never reach their full potential weight, which is a huge loss of profit to the farmer, and it's also a huge animal welfare problem. But if the calves are getting repeated respiratory infections, you don't just ask which antibiotic should I be using to treat this. You've got to ask what's driving it. Now, for example, is the ventilation in the cow housing poor? Have we got mixed ages of calves here? Have they brought cattle in from other farms without quarantining them? Is the farmer still vaccinating against the common causes of pneumonia? Is the stocking density too high? And is it, what's the underlying cause? Is it a bacterial infection? Is it a viral infection? Is it potentially lungworm, which is a parasite? Is it a combination of all three? And that habit of thinking in systems and treating the causes rather than just treating the symptoms is essential. And it turns out that understanding the underlying cause of problems is important in politics as well. Because the decisions that shape antimicrobial resistance or zoonotic spillover, when diseases spill over from animals into humans, vaccine access and disease surveillance, they're not made in microbiology labs. They're often made in ministries of finance, they're made in foreign offices, they're made in parliaments, and frustratingly, they're often made with influence on social media as well. And I spent about 16 years working as a veterinary surgeon before entering Parliament. And what I want to talk about this evening is how the mindset of veterinary epidemiology, that's understanding systems, can become increasingly important for understanding some of the biggest risks and issues that we're facing in the world today. So I'm going to start with a disease that vets will know very well, and that's rabies. About 60,000 people a year die from rabies. And I've done a lot of work, especially in India, where many people die every year. And it's fascinating work, actually. And actually, I'll slightly deviate. One of my favourite stories from working in India is that we treat, I'll talk about the main work we do is the rabies control programs, but we also treat a lot of working horses. About 200 million families rely primarily on a horse for their income. And if there's normally a donkey or a mule, actually, and if it dies, then they go even further into poverty. And so people will bring donkeys maybe 100 miles for you to treat them. And I remember once having to remove a skin tumour off a horse. It's called a sarcoid. If anyone keeps horses, it's a very common type of skin tumour. You see them every week when you're treating horses in the UK. And what we normally do is remove it surgically, and then you put chemotherapy cream on it. And I was in India, and I didn't know what sort of chemotherapy cream I could get hold of. So I emailed my professor back at Liverpool University, and he said, what you need to do is put Piles cream on it 3 times a day, and a drug called a Micromod, which I hadn't heard of before. It's an immune modulator, and that will help stop it growing back. So I had to take a rickshaw down to the local pharmacy, and I realised that when you don't speak the language and you want lots of Piles cream, it gets quite embarrassing. And if anyone's ever worked in India, you'll find everyone's very friendly, very helpful, and more people started to get involved in the translation, including the rickshaw driver, about a dozen people. And I eventually you didn't really want to act out that you need Piles cream, but I communicated that I needed Piles cream, and so they realised what I needed, and so they got a few tubes of it. But of course, I needed a lot because this skin tumour was quite big, and it's about the size of a dinner plate, and I needed to put it on about 3 times a day. And so they had to send some kid off on a bike to get more Piles cream because I cleared the pharmacy out, and it would never enter the head that you're treating a horse. And then we also had to communicate I needed this Imicromod cream that I hadn't heard of before, and it turned out that's used to treat genital warts. so they had to send the kid off on the bike to get a load more genital wart cream as well. And when you think your humiliation is complete and I just want to get back to the clinic and not see anyone, I got back to the rickshaw, and the rickshaw driver had very kindly found some cushions for me to sit on the way home. So but I say about 60,000 people a year die from rabies, and it's a disease you get from dog bites. Dogs are the reservoir of the disease. And if you're a politician under pressure to do something, there's 2 very obvious solutions quite quickly. One of them is to have a huge human vaccination program to try and reduce the cases of rabies. But interestingly, that doesn't actually reduce the number of human cases of rabies. Because if you get bitten by a rabid dog, you still need to go and get post-exposure treatment, which some of you might have experienced if you've travelled abroad. And obviously, it's over a month's salary for the average Indian. The dog that bit you may or may not have had rabies, so do you waste all that money if it's unnecessary? Often it's children who get bitten, they don't report they've been bitten. So when you have human vaccination programs, it doesn't actually reduce the cases of rabies. Now, the other solution, which looks really decisive, and it looks like you're taking strong action, is to cull the dogs. And that has been done in several countries around the world historically. And paradoxically, when you kill dogs, even though they are the source of the rabies, human rabies cases tend to go up. And that is because those dogs that you've killed, there's now a sort of vacuum, and new dogs move in from elsewhere, and they often bring rabies with them. The population is now unstable. They're more likely to fight each other, more to bite each other, and that means rabies spreads among the dogs more, and more humans die from rabies. If you vaccinate and neuter those dogs, you know that those dogs are safe, and you know the population remains stable, and they'll keep other dogs out. And if you get 70% of dogs vaccinated, human rabies cases will drop to 0. And I have worked in Jaipur for many years repeatedly. We have 85% of the dogs vaccinated, and there hasn't been a single human case there except for over 15 years. And the first time actually I ever went to Parliament was about 10 years ago. I was representing the British Veterinary Association at the launch of the End Rabies Now initiative, which is a global programme to vaccinate 70% of dogs by 2030 to prevent all human cases of rabies. So the evidence, it's a really good example actually of joined up thinking, because clinicians and epidemiologists generate the evidence. Then you've got politicians and international organisations providing the policy framework and the funding. And then the NGOs and the communities run vaccination and neutering programmes. And it's a very clear example where political theatre can diverge from epidemiological reality. Because taking the tough action and the obvious action can sometimes make the problem worse. And yet the solution that actually works is quieter, more technical, less glamorous, but a lot more effective. And this lesson sits at the heart of what we now call One Health. So One Health is the recognition that animal health, human health, and environmental health are inseparable. And veterinary medicine sits at that interaction. Now we see in veterinary medicine how antimicrobial use in livestock can drive the development of resistant bacteria, the so-called superbugs, which can spread and make human infections harder and sometimes impossible to treat. And we can see how climate change is altering the spread of diseases that are carried by vectors like mosquitoes and midges. And diseases that were classified as tropical when I was at university are now being seen elsewhere in the world. And we also see how pollution and fecal contamination, whether that is agricultural runoff or whether it's sewage, allow pathogens to move through water and into food systems, and that's increasing the risk of disease. So the biggest health risks of the 21st century don't sit neatly inside one sector. You've got pandemics, antimicrobial resistance, climate-driven disease. They're not purely medical problems. They're systems problems. And one of the things I've found, whether you're speaking in Parliament, working with universities, engaging with industry, is that our systems are too often set up to treat these issues in isolation. So, for example, 3 out of every 4 new and emerging infectious diseases are from an animal origin. And you think HIV, the current Ebola outbreak, SARS, COVID-19 being the most recent example, avian influenza, probably the most likely candidate for the next pandemic in humans. The next pandemic is almost certainly going to be a zoonotic spillover from an animal health problem, and that will be picked up in animals before it is picked up in humans. And this means that vets and wildlife experts and environmental scientists are often the first line of defence. But the difficulty is that all our institutions are organised into silos. So health ministries deal with hospitals, agricultural departments deal with livestock, and environmental departments deal with ecosystems. But the threats we face cross all of them, and one of the most powerful and most overlooked drivers of disease is conflict. So war destroys public health systems with remarkable speed. Vaccination programs collapse, disease surveillance stops, and sanitation systems break down. And conflict also drives a mass displacement, forcing people into overcrowded conditions where infectious diseases can spread rapidly. And it disrupts agriculture, veterinary services, it halts livestock vaccination and disease monitoring, and accelerates one of the most serious threats we face today, which we're talking about tonight, which is antimicrobial resistance. So the war in Ukraine is a really good example where it's dramatically accelerated the spread of multi-drug resistant infections. So in Ukraine, over 80% of wounds picked up in soldiers have got new bacteria that are resistant to multiple antibiotics. And it's such a problem, it's now become a limiting factor on returning soldiers to the front line. Infections that used to be a complication of war wounds are becoming a limiting factor in the actual war effort. And earlier this year became, as far as I'm aware, the first MP in over a decade to bring up antimicrobial resistance at Prime Minister's questions, and I did it with respect to Ukraine. And we managed to influence the 100-year deal that was signed with Ukraine to include rapid diagnostic tests and medical support rather than just military support, because by reframing this from not just being a public health problem, but being a national security problem, suddenly politicians find that a lot more interesting. Because politicians who don't see the importance of a future public health problem, they really do sit up when you explain that it's affecting whether soldiers return to the front line or whether patients are going to be remaining in hospital longer, and as you said, taking up extra resources and extra money. But also, like all geopolitical threats, and I thought it was mentioned in the previous talk really well, these bacteria do not respect national borders. Now, I've driven ambulances out to Ukraine carrying medical equipment, including these rapid diagnostic tests. And one of my proudest academic achievements is myself and some of my team got published in the scientific journal Nature, discussing the impact of war and conflict on pushing the incidence of antimicrobial resistance. So it's a security problem, it's a humanitarian problem, and it's a geopolitical problem, not just a microbiology problem. And we cannot continue to treat it like some kind of niche scientific issue. And I think antimicrobial resistance could well be described as a slow pandemic that never really makes the front pages. In 2019, almost 5 million people globally died as a result of antimicrobial resistance. And that's predicted to hit round about 39 million by the year 2040. Before antibiotics, simple cuts could be fatal, elective surgery was risky, and childbirth carried a significant infection risk. And we're risking drifting back into that world. We have to remember that it's not only about getting, I think people often think it's about if you get an injury or a wound, you might die of infection, which is true. That's what happens if our antibiotics stop working. But it also means that nearly all the advances in medicine over the last 60 years are also made redundant. So it wouldn't be worth you having a hip replacement if there's a high risk that you could get an infection and that leg might have to be amputated, or you might get sepsis and die. You're better off putting up with an arthritic, painful hip. All the advances in heart surgery for the last 50 years, too risky. It's nearly any medical intervention you can think of would not be worth risking when it comes to surgery because of the risk you could die from an infection, and you're better off just living with the disease that we're trying to fix. And of course, and I'll call it AMR, antimicrobial resistance as AMR. It doesn't just affect humans. It affects terrestrial, livestock, aquatic animals. Fish farming is a huge industry. It means more treatment failures, more production losses, and more pressure on farmer livelihoods. And when AMR bites into those systems, it isn't just an animal health issue, it's a food security issue and also a poverty issue. Now, for the good news is in the UK, the amounts of antibiotics used in livestock has been reduced by 59%, over half, in the last 10 years. And that is a massive success story, and it's happened because of collaborative work between vets, farmers, industry, and regulators and policymakers. And it's proof that evidence-informed policy and combined with practical sector-led solutions really can move the needle. But one of the things that's really struck me, including at conferences in the Royal College of Physicians, where I was the only MP, but crucially the only veterinary voice in the room, is how often these discussions are still happening in silos without a true One Health perspective. And one of the key drivers of antimicrobial resistance is something quite simple. Actually, it's getting the dose wrong. And that's why in veterinary medicine, we're absolutely rigorous about knowing the weight of an animal before we give antibiotics. And actually, during COVID, I was on the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, the Council of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, which is the regulatory body for vets. So we set the rules like the GMC for doctors. And we changed the rules so that people could prescribe antibiotics without physically examining and weighing the animal. So that it meant owners could avoid making unnecessary journeys and potentially spreading COVID. But it did mean that people had to weigh their animals at home. And and I remember we'd often, one guy, actually this happened more than once, but someone was telling me that they had weighing scales at home they could use, the bathroom scales. But he said a dog kilo is the same as human kilos. And I was like, well, no, there's 7 dog kilos in every human kilo. And my favourite one was this lady who was trying to weigh her cat, and she couldn't get him to stay on the weighing scales. He kept running off, and so she phoned, and I said, well, why don't you just hold your cat and weigh yourself and the cat, and then just weigh yourself without the cat. And she goes, oh, I couldn't do the maths like that. And I said, well, I can help you if you don't mind me knowing what you weigh. And she goes, okay, well, do I leave my shoes on or do I have them off? And I was like, anyway, she phoned back about 10 minutes later, and she gave me the weight of her, and she gave me the weight of herself and the cat, and we worked out what we thought the cat weighed. And just before we finished, she said, oh, did you have your shoes on or off out of interest? And she goes, well, I had them on when I weighed myself, but I had them off when I weighed me and the cat. But the point is serious. If you get the dose wrong, you don't just risk treatment failure, you risk creating resistant infections. So if the dose is too low, you won't kill all the bacteria, but they will have experienced some of the antibiotic. And the ones that survive are the ones that are resistant to the antibiotic, and they're the ones that multiply. And resistant bacteria, they do not respect borders. They move with people, they move with animals, they move with food, and they move with trade. And when I was working in Iraq, we had a lot of Syrian refugees pouring over the border into Iraq, often with their livestock, herds of sheep and goats at foot with them. And it means that antimicrobial resistance anywhere in the world eventually becomes antimicrobial resistance everywhere. And there's sometimes put it is that bacteria are the ultimate beneficiaries of globalization. So it's why global surveillance and global collaboration are absolutely critical. And when we cut support for that work, we're not saving money, we're taking down the flood defences and just hoping that the river behaves. So last year, I secured a debate about the impact of the United States withdrawing from the World Health Organization and the scaling back of several other global health programs which sent shocks through the global health system. And I said then that global health isn't charity, it's actually security and it's self-interest. Because supporting health systems, international health systems, doesn't just save lives overseas, it keeps us safer here at home. Stronger systems abroad mean fewer outbreaks reaching our shores, and more stable trading partners, and a healthier global economy that Britain depends on. Now, all of this, surveillance systems, vaccination programs, antimicrobial monitoring, depends on global health infrastructure. Organisations like the Fleming Fund, the World Health Organization, the Global Fund, Gavi, they form part of that system, and that system now is under severe pressure. And when surveillance systems weaken, outbreaks are detected later. And when vaccination programs falter, diseases quietly start to resurge. And when antimicrobial monitoring disappears, resistant strains start to spread silently. And it protects international trade, it stabilizes economies, and it reduces the risk of pandemics reaching our shores. Now, we learnt during COVID that the events that are taking place maybe in a wet market the other side of the world, maybe in a hospital or a laboratory or an airport the other side of the world, can have a direct effect on life here in Winchester within weeks. Because global health has become local health. And that is why decisions to cut international health funding are not simply accounting decisions. They're choices about the strength or the weakness of the systems that are protecting us here in the UK. The Liberal Democrats delivered 0.7% of GDP for overseas development when we were in government, and we enshrined it in law. The Conservatives cut this to 0.5%, and Labour have now just cut this to 0.3%, and there's rumours it could be cut back even further. Now, each cut is a choice, and each choice has consequences. And there's another challenge we have to confront. Across many democracies, including our own, scientific evidence is increasingly being pulled into political and cultural battles. We've seen climate change dismissed as woke, and we've seen concern about the future of the planet caricatured rather than genuinely engaged with. And we've seen the rise of political movements, including figures like Donald Trump internationally, and sometimes parties like Reform UK here, that have been associated with climate change denial and anti-vaccination misinformation. And we've seen at times governments struggle to act consistently on scientific advice when it becomes politically inconvenient. So we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic what happened when scientific advice was delayed or sidelined. You get confusion, you get mixed messaging, and ultimately you get avoidable harm, both in public health and in the economy. And this is not confined to just one issue. Whether we're dealing with climate change, antimicrobial resistance, the next pandemic, the pattern is the same. When politicians ignore scientific evidence and ignore scientific warnings, people die and economies suffer. And the risks that could have been managed early on become crises. Now, everyone in this room, you all have your own political views, and that's healthy. Well, I hope you only have one political view. Anyway, but that's entirely right. It's entirely healthy. But in a world of pandemics, climate shocks, antimicrobial resistance, people of all political colours should be able to agree on one thing. Electing leaders who disregard or weaponise science is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And this is where politics really matters. Because the decisions about whether we invest in surveillance systems, whether we support global health programs, whether we act early or wait for crisis, these are political choices. Because different political approaches lead to different political outcomes. And in this space, these outcomes are measured in lives, in economic stability, and in national security. So who we elect depends whether science is followed or whether science is ignored. And that brings me to universities and research institutes. In some political debates, universities are treated as a battleground in which we're going to fight culture wars, and a place to fight over cancel culture or to bang on about symbols. But we should be seeing them very differently. They're actually one of the UK's greatest strategic assets, especially when it comes to soft power. The UK has the chance to lead the world in global health innovation while strengthening our economy. We have significant human capital in our universities, our businesses, our learned societies, our research institutes. And if we invest now, we can be a global hub for public health expertise, vaccine development, artificial intelligence, and cutting-edge medical research. And they are where the evidence is generated, where the innovation happens, where the next generations of solutions are being built. We can export solutions, shape international policy, and create high-skilled jobs right here at home in the UK. And I had many of my friends lost jobs in university research departments because the research they were doing was technically funded by overseas development money. So it's UK jobs that are also lost. So universities should not be political footballs. They should be powerhouses of discovery, opportunity and progress. And if we get this right, we won't just be protecting global health, we'll be securing Britain's future as a leader in the industries of the future. And that's not just good for global public health, it's good for economic growth, it's good for innovation and for Britain's position in the world. And that's why I want to talk about Rotary tonight as well. It's why the work you do as the Rotary Club really, really does matter. And more than most people realise, I think. Because polio eradication is one of the greatest public health achievements in human history. In 1988, there were an estimated 350,000 cases of wild-type polio worldwide in 125 countries. In 2021, there are only 6 reported cases. Today, transmission remains endemic only in 2 countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And we're tantalizingly close to making polio the 3rd disease that we could eradicate from the face of the planet. We've only ever eradicated 2 diseases before in the history of mankind, both achieved by sustained global vaccination programs. So in 1977, we eradicated smallpox. This killed between 300 million and 500 million people in the 20th century alone. It is probably the single biggest medical intervention that has saved the most lives, is a smallpox vaccine. In 2011, we eradicated rinderpest, a virus also known as cattle plague. Rinderpest was the most devastating livestock disease in history. It was capable of wiping out entire herds because it had a 100% mortality rate, and its impact extended far beyond animal health. It triggered catastrophic famines, it destroyed ecosystems, and it caused economies to collapse. And now, like smallpox, it is consigned to the history books. And that progress wasn't delivered by a single government, a single scientist, or a single organisation. It required international cooperation, scientific innovation, community engagement, political commitment, sustained over decades. And it demonstrates something really important, that global health problems can be solved when we choose to invest in prevention, when we choose to act on evidence, and when we recognise that protecting other people ultimately helps us protect ourselves. So in closing, the biggest risks of the 21st century will not arrive neatly packaged as health problems, environmental problems, or security problems. These are how do we feed 8 billion people sustainably and give them energy? How do we prevent the next pandemic, which will almost certainly be spillover from an animal disease? How do we fight antimicrobial resistance, which is making minor infections deadly again and already killing over 1 million people a year? How do we preserve biodiversity, and crucially, our pollinators, which are the very ecosystems that sustain all life? And how do we prepare, even in the UK, for a notifiable disease outbreak that could devastate the livestock industry and our economy? I'm not posing rhetorical questions. These are urgent, current, global challenges that need solutions now. And if we keep treating them separately, we will keep responding to crises. If we treat them as one system, we have a chance of actually preventing them. Now, there's a line from Bruce Springsteen that I often quote when it comes to, I think it was really apt when it comes to global health, is nobody wins unless everybody wins. And if polio exists anywhere, it is our problem. If antimicrobial resistance is emerging somewhere else in the world, it'll reach our hospitals. And if a disease with pandemic potential emerges anywhere, it quickly becomes everybody's problem. And if crops fail in one part of the world, the consequences are not restricted to one geographical area. They are felt globally. Global health and food security, they don't just sit alongside the great political challenges of our time. They actually sit upstream of them. Extreme weather leads to crop failure. Crop failure leads to food insecurity. Food insecurity drives instability, mass people displacement, and conflict. And those pressures don't stay contained. They affect global supply chains, which means they affect prices in our supermarket shelves here in the UK. They drive displacement and migration, which shows up in the political debates we're having today, for example, about small boats. and they create the conditions for international instability, which, if unmanaged, can spill over into social and economic pressures right here at home. So when we talk about food security, water security, energy security, or global public health, we're not talking about distant, abstract environmental concerns. We're talking about the foundations of political stability, of uncontested borders, of the international rule of law, of economic stability, of manageable migration, and of a society that feels resilient and secure. And in the world we're living in today, these connections are no longer theoretical, they're already being played out. Because global health is not charity. It is shared safety, it is shared responsibility, and if we're ambitious enough, it is shared opportunity. Thank you.